I am speaking with our State Senator Bruce Tarr on yet another very hot and dry day on Cape Ann. Hi, Senator. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well, Heather. Thank you. How are you?
I'm okay. Let's start right off by talking about the drought. Since I've known you, since we've been having these conversations, you have been following drought conditions, and this is something that is definitely in your mind. Maybe it's the fact that your family were farmers, but but tell us what you're hearing about these
Well,
conditions.
absolutely. And Heather, you and I were talking before we went on air about the fact that we have had a sustained number of days when it's been very hot. And that is exacerbating the drought that we're in, which is very significant. But unfortunately, these are not uncommon occurrences. And we need to address the issue, and we need to try to be proactive and not reactive when it comes to drought situations, because you can't address the issue quickly. Having more water supply or proper means of distributing water or conservation, those all take time. And so we need to get out ahead of it. And it's why I've been working on efforts for a number of years now to try to be proactive. We've gotten the State Department of Environmental Protection to have a drought task force that's been working on the issue. The drought plan for the state has been revised. You can see some of that in the news almost every day now when our weather reporters are reporting about the drought. They're talking about the drought levels that are in the statewide drought plan. But I'm also trying to work on something more locally, and that is the task force that we convene for all of the communities that either draw water from the Ipswich River or are connected to communities that draw water from the Ipswich River or could. And so that task force has been working now for a couple of years, but it really began in earnest about a year ago now to try to focus its efforts on action steps. And I'm very pleased to report that we actually had a meeting this morning, and we have nearly every community that touches the Ipswich River in some way or its watershed ready to agree to a charter statement to work together. And that may not seem like a lot, but it's been a monumental accomplishment because all of these stakeholders have different perspectives and different issues. And so we've been working with an outstanding facilitation team of 3 people that have been doing the day-to-day work of talking to everyone and putting the pieces together. And I think this will be an unprecedented effort for any region in Massachusetts to have this kind of focused, committed effort on trying to make sure that we do 2 things. Number one, we protect the ecological health of the river and the aquifers that support the river, but 2, making sure that we have adequate supplies of water. And even that question is one that's more complex than it sounds, because adequacy is sometimes in the eyes of the beholder. So we are ready, and I think very soon we'll be able to announce the signing of this charter statement by all of the communities. And on the heels of that, I was able to secure $100,000 in last year's budget, state budget, to begin studying what our options might be. And we are still finishing the scope of work for that study, and we're going to be able to advance that. I actually got the appropriation continued into this fiscal year so we could finish. And I also put $150,000 in this year's budget so that we can continue to do the work of the studies. And on top of that, the Ipswich River Watershed Association and the town of Hamilton got a grant from the state, a so-called SWIMMY grant, a strategic water management grant. And the work has already begun to see how we might link communities in our region. And that's important, number one, because they'd be able to share water if one had some and could help another neighboring community. But in addition, there are 2 other possibilities, and one is trying to tie into the MWRA for an emergency connection so that if we didn't have alternatives, we could import water from the MWRA, who has indicated to us that they could easily supply that connection. And the second is to look at building a new regional reservoir in the town of Topsfield on land that actually has already been purchased for that purpose by the Salem Beverly Water Supply Board. So there's a lot to this. And the thing that I'm most pleased with is we are not sitting back and trying to react to drought conditions. We are trying to get ahead of them and build a long-term plan for the future, because this is likely going to continue to be an issue. And that's before you get to the need to build more housing. And I think we're all aware that Massachusetts has a very significant housing shortage. Well, if you're going to build those units of housing, they have to be supplied with water. So this is an ongoing issue. And I'm glad you asked the question. And I'm really glad that we are starting to see the benefits now of the region-wide conversation that we've been having, which I think is going to serve us very well.
Well, I want to follow up with that in some of our next interviews, but we have a lot to cover tonight. Mostly the fact that you have this marathon session in the Senate on Sunday night, I believe. You pulled an all-nighter, as we used to say. Do you want to tell us what got you to that point and how it went?
Sure. I'm happy to tell you. And I'm going to go back just a little bit to one of our prior civics lessons on the show and remind folks that the Constitution in Massachusetts requires the House and the Senate to meet every 72 hours. But there are two kinds of sessions, formal and informal. And the rules that have been adopted by the House and the Senate require that in an even numbered year, the formal session ends on the last day of July. And again, a formal session means sessions where matters of controversy are taken up, where roll call votes can be taken, and where there is debate, as opposed to an informal session where any member can object and stop consideration of something, and there are no roll calls. So said in a different way, all of the serious business that could be controversial needs to be finished by the last day of July. And so that meant that this week we didn't see an unusual situation. We were in session on Saturday and Sunday. And on Sunday, we went throughout the night. It's not uncommon for us to go a little bit past midnight, and we'll suspend our own rules to be able to do that. But in this case, it was extreme. And we went through the night and well into the next morning. And I'll be the first to tell you, Heather, and I won't conceal it, I was not happy about that. I think that we need to learn to do better, and we need to learn not to be in these last minute situations where we've got really important legislation that's moving quickly in the middle of the night without the opportunity for proper scrutiny, certainly by the public, but I would also argue by the members. And there were some really important things that were in play in those last hours. And so I think I returned home from the State House on Monday. I think I got home at about 1 p.m. And I had arrived at the State House at about 10 p.m. on Sunday. So it was a very long period of time.
Well, tell us what was accomplished.
So some things made it through the end of the process and some that didn't, and some didn't. One of the things that's important to remember is a lot of what was taken up in those final days were the reports of conference committees. So these are matters where the House and the Senate had adopted different versions of a bill on the same subject, and 3 members of the House and 3 members of the Senate had been working together to try to reach a reconciliation of those 2 different versions. So one of the most notable that's certainly gotten a lot of attention is sports betting. And that really came down to the 11th wire. I'm mixing metaphors. It came down to the 11th hour or down to the wire.
Down to the wire.
And it actually got to the governor's desk. And I'm pleased that it did. It was definitely a compromise. And there were a lot of things that were in play relative to college betting or betting on college sports, relative to the tax rate, relative to advertising. So all of those things in the end got worked out to the satisfaction of the conferees, and the full House and Senate endorsed the bill, and now it's on the governor's desk.
So can you just tell us a little bit of that compromise? What I know the House wanted all college betting to be on and the Senate wanted none. Is that how it went down?
That's a fairly accurate generalization. So where we wound up was that betting would be allowed on colleges that were not in Massachusetts, unless they were part of a national tournament. So that was a pretty fair compromise, in my opinion. I'd always had concerns about the pressure on our students in Massachusetts if folks in state were allowed to bet on them. So there was a compromise on that. The other compromise, or another compromise, related to the amount of taxation on the proceeds of the betting. So in my opinion, the Senate had a number that was much too high as 35%, which would make us non-competitive with other states. So the compromise that was reached was 15% taxation on in-person betting, and 20% taxation on remote betting. So if someone was using a platform electronically like DraftKings or some of the others. So that was a pretty fair compromise. And then one thing that the Senate had insisted on, which turned out not to be that practical, was a ban on advertising during the sporting events of the gaming platforms, and that didn't survive. So the bill is now on the governor's desk. Now, the governor has a lot of power in this situation because he could send back the bill and amend it and send it back, in which case we're not in formal session. So we still could respond, but it's a much more difficult process when everyone has to agree to the response. Or he could veto it, and we don't have the ability right now to take up that veto. Now, one thing that's important to remember is we could suspend the rule and come back to session, but we have historically been very reluctant to do that because once you open those floodgates, now the question is what gets in and what gets out. So we've been very adamant about observing the rule. And one of the few times that we have suspended it was when we could not get the budget done due to COVID-19. And that was the year we did the budget in the fall, and we suspended the rule so that we could take it up. But I don't see it happening with regard to sports betting or some of the other bills that we're going to discuss.
So because it's so late, anything that the governor sends back basically dies.
That's correct. The governor has 10 days to act on anything that we send. And certainly now we are well past the last day in July. So the governor has a lot of power in these situations, but there's always the ability to negotiate. And there could be a situation where the governor and the House and the Senate negotiate and agree on something that could, in theory, pass in an informal session.
Oh, that's interesting. So negotiation is, it's not called a session. It's just you email each other and say, I like this and I like that. How's that?
Sometimes we even sit at a table and talk. Right. But again, the agreement has to be pretty much universal. And the difficulty is making sure that everyone's part of the conversation. So there are 160 members of the House and 40 members of the Senate. Any one of them can object in an informal session. So it's really a Herculean task, but it can be done.
Interesting. So what else do you anticipate will succeed on the governor's desk?
One thing that I'm particularly proud of is the mental health bill that you and I had talked about when the Senate passed it. And I'm pleased that we were able to reach agreement with the House, which was not always a given throughout the last couple of months. But it's an outstanding bill that does things like try to reduce the number of pediatric psych patients that are boarding in hospital emergency departments to get them out into more appropriate settings, and requiring insurance to pay for an annual mental health screening, the same way that it pays for a physical health screening. So there are many, many dimensions of this bill, and we've talked about them in the past, but I think it is a major advancement for trying to improve our mental health system. And the most significant piece of it is language to strengthen the concept of mental health parity. And we had talked before about the fact that in the, I believe it was 2008, we had passed a mental health parity law that said that mental health has to be treated in an equivalent way to physical health. But even though we passed it so long ago, that still has not been achieved. We passed another law, I think it was 2014, to move the ball further. And in this bill, we try to get absolute parity accomplished. And that is significant. And my sense is the governor won't veto it. There may be other parts of the bill that he doesn't like, so we don't know what's going to happen yet. But one way or the other, I would predict that we're going to see major advancements, legislative advancements on the front of mental health as a result of what we did.
That is exciting. Now, the economic development bill didn't even make it to the governor's desk. Do you want to talk about that?
Absolutely. And I would say that this is the most significant bill that didn't make it. It's the most significant victim of the last minute process that we were going through. And it was an extremely large bill. You may recall that it was about $3.66 billion in spending. Some of that was from ARPA, from the federal government, the relief money that they gave us due to COVID-19. Some of it was due to the state surplus that we're continuing to experience. And there were all manner of projects funded in this bill. Just a whole host of things for communities all across the state. And also, very importantly, included in that bill was a tax relief package that was very similar to the one that I had been offering in a couple of different ways. It totaled altogether about $1 billion. And unfortunately, there was no agreement by the deadline on that particular bill. So, as I mentioned, it is possible that the bill could be resurrected in the informal session. The conference committee is still constituted and did not reject the bill outright. So it's still a possibility. But with a bill of this size and this complexity, achieving the consensus that's needed in an informal session is going to be extremely difficult.
Well, what I understood was that this Chapter 62F was what hung everybody up, right? Suddenly there was this discovered 1986 voter law that said, you tell me about tax relief.
So it definitely was a complicating factor.
Okay.
So the law has been in existence since 1986. It was only triggered one other time, and that was in 1987. And because it was triggered, there are already regulations on how to implement it. And so that stuff doesn't need to be reinvented. And essentially what it does is use a 3-year moving average for the last 3 years and caps how much tax revenue can be collected in the current year based on that average and a couple of other factors. And I won't profess to you to completely understand that formula, and I won't try to explain it here, but it is a moving average. And so the folks at the Ways and Means Committees, the House and Senate Ways and Means Committees, had written to the Secretary of Administration and Finance, Mike Heffernan, and they had asked, by the way, do we trigger this year? Because most years we don't. We never have the amount of revenue that brings us close to the trigger. But as we've talked about, we are in extraordinary times, and revenue continues to come in at rates that I've never seen before. And I dare say that they're nearly historic.
And I'm not sure, did we make it clear that the trigger means the state sends money back to the citizens?
No, and that's an important thing to remind folks.
Okay.
So if we hit that trigger, the amount of revenue is capped at that amount, the formulaic amount that's yielded by the formula that I described. When that happens, all of the dollars that are collected over that, the excess revenue, has to be returned to the taxpayers through rebates. And there's some flexibility in the regulations and the law about how that can be done. But generally it would be a rebate based on your tax return, and it would be calculated after a date certain in September, when the comptroller and the state auditor determine how much we exceed the trigger and if we've even reached it. So they would do a report, we'd know how much money that was available, and that would go back to the taxpayers. Now, one thing, Heather, that I think has been lost a little bit in the conversation is that sometimes this has been characterized as an either or, that we could either return the money that would be required under Mass General Laws Chapter 62F, or we could do the tax relief package that was included in the Economic Development Bill. According to the Secretary of Administration and Finance, those are not mutually exclusive, that our levels of revenue are sufficient that we could actually do both. And not only could we do both, but we could have a stabilization fund, notwithstanding all of that spending and rebating and the other things, that would still be in excess of $7 billion. Now, the Secretary is not alone in that opinion. The Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation did an analysis and issued a briefing to us as legislators. I believe it's a public document that suggested the same thing, that you could accommodate what's in the Economic Development Bill, and you could accommodate Mass General Laws Chapter 62F. But here's the complicating factor. We all have seen that there are signals that we may be headed toward a recession. In fact, there are some that would suggest we're in the recession. And the concern has been that while we're flush with resources right now, if we go into a recession, we may need some additional resources, even beyond the stabilization fund. And that's where the hesitance comes. And so there was an earnest discussion in the last couple of days of the session about that situation. And again, part of the complication is that the numbers that are generated for Chapter 62F, we don't receive until September. We think the number is between $2.5 and $3 billion, but we don't know that. So that was part of the complication that happened. I think it's fair to say, and it's no secret, that I was very disappointed that we weren't able to get the economic development bill done with the tax cuts as had been approved by the House and the Senate. I certainly think there are ways that we could reconcile that with Chapter 62F. But right now, we are at a standstill in terms of the economic development bill and the tax relief package. Massachusetts General Laws Chapter 62F is law. And unless somebody does something to change it, it will be law. And so it moves forward. It doesn't require us to do anything. The issue is, how do we affect the other things that we have done to account for Massachusetts General Laws Chapter 62F if we need to make any adjustment at all.
So you have to wait until you return to formal sessions to bring this up then? Maybe, okay.
Maybe. Because, so, I mean, bear in mind that Chapter 62F will go into effect sometime in September, maybe early October. So we have time, and there's a lot of disappointment on Beacon Hill about not being able to do the economic development bill and not being able to deliver the tax relief that we've been waiting for so long and that I've been working on for so long. So it is not inconceivable that there would be an attempt to have the conference committee continue to meet, to try to reach resolution, and to try to seek that very challenging consensus that might allow something to happen in an informal session. And in the interest of being completely comprehensive, it is possible that we could suspend the rules and come in a day that is not before the last day in July, and still consider it. So there are a lot of moving pieces, and I know that oftentimes in the media we hear that every legislator is on vacation, everything is stopped on the 31st of July. Well, that isn't true in any year, but it's certainly not true this year. And there's a lot of attention still being paid to this issue.
And you are almost never on vacation. We know that. so we just have a few more minutes. Do you think we have time to cover the dangerousness bill? Okay.
I think we can quickly, because I think it's extremely important. So just to remind folks the context here, in Massachusetts, I believe it is Chapter 58A of the general laws, there is the opportunity in a trial, at the beginning of a trial, for a prosecutor to seek what is known as a dangerousness hearing. And it's important to understand that bail in Massachusetts is not allowed to be set in such a way that A, it's unaffordable by the defendant, and it's also not meant to be used as a means to incarcerate the defendant. It's really meant as a way to ensure that the defendant comes back to trial. It's a guarantee. So dangerousness is a concept that's used for those who pose a threat right now, for whom bail is not appropriate. And right now in Massachusetts, you can already seek a dangerousness hearing if you're the prosecution on an enumerated list of things that's in the statute. That list, unfortunately, does not cover a lot of the situations where dangerousness might arise. So Governor Baker and Lieutenant Governor Polito have been, for the last few years, filing a bill to reform that system, to allow more crimes to be considered and be the underpinning for a dangerousness hearing. Their bill would have also allowed an individual who was found to be dangerous to be held until the completion of the trial. And that's a significant difference from existing law, which, depending on which court you're in, sets that limit at 120 or 180 days. So that was a significant change. In addition to that, there were other portions of their bill that dealt with the breathalyzer device on motor vehicles and the GPS. It's often referred to colloquially as a bracelet that probationers wear to ensure that they are not venturing to places where they're not allowed to under the terms of their probation or their other supervision. So that was an important part of the bill. Another part of the bill requires that when someone is detained because they're dangerous, the victim in the crime must be notified at least 6 hours in advance of their release. And there were other parts of the bill as well. So the governor's bill went to the Committee on the Judiciary. The committee took until very, very late in the legislative session, literally just a few days ago, to send the bill to a study. And that was very disappointing to a lot of us, particularly because we had agreed to give the committee more time. We allowed them to use a mechanism called extension to continue to have more time to think about it. And yet there was no report that came from the committee. It was basically killed for the rest of the legislative session. Well, that was very upsetting to the governor and lieutenant governor and all of the victims all around the state who had been coming out to roundtables to have very public discussions, which are very difficult to do if you're a victim, about what they've been through. Long story short, there was a provision in the state budget that authorized free phone calls for prisoners. Right now, prisoners are charged for their phone calls. The governor isolated that provision in the budget and sent it back to the legislature with an amendment with a scaled down version of his dangerousness bill. The House rejected that further amendment. And then it came to the Senate, and I rolled up my sleeves and I said, this is too an important issue to let go of. A lot of people have done an awful lot to tell their story, to relive the dangerous experiences, the harrowing experiences that they've had, and to try to make this work. And so I sat down and redrafted it yet again to reduce the scope of it and to make it something that I thought it could be the product of consensus. So with that amendment from the governor now before the Senate, we again, over my objection, rejected the governor's initial amendment. And then we went to debate on my amendment. And when I say my amendment, it's important to understand, Heather, I offered it, but there was broad bipartisan support for it. Both Republicans and Democrats co-sponsored my amendment. And the most amazing thing happened at about 1 o'clock in the morning. We had a full and fair and passionate debate in the Massachusetts Senate on this issue. The debate that had been waiting to happen for a very long time. In fact, some of the House members came over to watch the debate and then they took a break from their deliberations. The long story short is the amendment that I put forward, again, with a lot of support, passed 30-8. And so now the issue is back before the House. It is in formal session. We'll see what they do.
All right. Well, we only have a few seconds, so we have to leave this cliffhanger. But I'm sure we'll find out what happened to the Dangerousness Bill the next time we speak, and we'll cover that. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Interested in a sponsorship? Email sponsor@1623studios.org to learn more.